not far from average for the time of year in Scotland, whilst it's sunnier and warmer elsewhere. And then into the outlook, well, the weather turns warmer still heading into the Easter weekend. For many places, it turns brighter, but there will still be a few showers around.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
And welcome to today's 2-hour special of On the Money. Here we're focused on the UK's cost of living crisis, helping you beat the squeeze. I'm Liam Halligan, and in this coming hour, we'll be talking about rising house prices and the increasing cost of rent. How can my kid afford a house? We hold a detailed discussion, as ever, with people who really know their stuff. Plus, as the price of potatoes, cooking oil and fish spirals, thousands of UK chip shops are feeling the financial heat. Is your local chippy under threat? All that and more after the GB News headlines with Rosie Wright.
A very good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date. The UK has warned all options will be on the table when it comes to the West's response if Russia uses chemical weapons in Ukraine. The government says it's working urgently to verify claims that chemical weapons were used in an attack in the city of Mariupol. The Foreign Secretary described any such action as a callous escalation in the conflict. The Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, told GB News he's worried about a renewed assault in the east.
I'm concerned in that I think that the fighting that is going to happen this spring and this summer in the Donbass is going to be extremely violent and will be quite a big army on quite a big army. They clearly have the May the 9th victory parade in mind as a date by which they need to have achieved something.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the chemical weapons threat is very real.
Один з рупорів окупантів заявив про те, що вони
One of the spokespeople of the invaders said they are considering using chemical weapons against the defenders of Mariupol. We take it very seriously. I want to remind world leaders that a possible use of chemical weapons had already been discussed by the Russian military. At the time, it meant the reaction to the Russian aggression should have been harsher and faster.
Well, meanwhile, Russia's president says attempts to isolate his country from the rest of the world will fail. Speaking in Russia's Far East, where he met his Belarusian counterpart Vladimir Putin, also said Moscow will never depend on the US and its allies again after they imposed crippling sanctions. Well, Putin also repeated his country's ambitions in Ukraine, saying the military operation will achieve its goals. In some other news now, the Conservative MP Crispin Blunt has apologised for defending the convicted sex offender Imran Ahmed Khan. He's the Wakefield MP who appeared in court yesterday, who was found guilty of sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy in 2008. He's now been expelled from the Tory party. Blunt said Khan was the victim of a dreadful miscarriage of justice, but he retracted that statement this morning. At least 30 new fines are going to be issued over COVID breaches at Downing Street and Whitehall. It brings the total number now to more than 50. The Met Police is investigating a dozen gatherings that were allegedly held during lockdown. Scotland Fine says more fines could come. More than 60 Extinction Rebellion activists have blocked the Lloyd's of London building. The demonstrators are demanding that the company stop insuring fossil fuel projects. Well, Lloyd's of London has advised its staff not to go to the affected office. Our reporter Alice Porter is on the scene.
Extinction Rebellion have been here for over 4 hours, causing so much trouble in the centre of the city. They've blockaded entrances and exits into Lloyd's. Many of them have glued their hands to the floor or have chained themselves to the railings to stop anyone coming in and out. The reason they're targeting Lloyd's is they say they insure fossil fuel technology, and they've been protesting last Friday of people coming into the city in regards to that. But they're also trying to recruit more people. Protesters say to me they're trying to recruit 3.5% of the population to join Extinction Rebellion and continue causing chaos in London and other cities as well.
The number of people on payrolls rose by 35,000 between February and March. But the latest figures from the Office for National Statistics also show workers suffered the biggest fall in real pay for almost 9 years. Experts are warning wages are set to lag even further, with inflation expected to soar by the autumn. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says his plans for a windfall tax would help ease the cost of living crisis.
The thing that's coming up over and over again is people saying, I can't afford to pay my bills. What are you going to do about it? So the Labour Party says we're going to have a windfall tax on oil and gas companies in the North Sea, profits they didn't expect to make because of the high global prices, use that to reduce energy bills by up to £600 for those that need it most.
A £2.6 billion government programme to improve flood defences is being expanded. The Department for Environment says 314,000 homes are now better protected following the original investment. The national flood risk is said to have been reduced by 5% over the past 6 years. Well, investing in the next 6 years to come, the government says another £5.2 billion has been allocated. You're up to date. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, let's head to Liam.
And coming up on The Money today in our 2-hour special, house prices are rising again and mortgage lenders are tightening affordability tests, making it even harder to borrow enough to buy a home. Is it any wonder millions of young adults can't afford their own place? How can my kid buy a house? We hold a detailed discussion. And is your local chippy under threat? With fish, potatoes and cooking oil costs spiralling, many of Britain's much-loved 10,000-plus chip shops are feeling the financial heat. The war in Ukraine and the related cost of living squeeze is now threatening the UK's national dish. Plus, each day on The Money features an in-depth Money Talks interview. Today, we're joined by the CEO of Clarion Housing Group, one of the UK's largest social housing landlords, responsible for thousands of council homes. That's later in the show. And as ever, I want your questions, opinions, ideas. What do you think of the issues raised in today's On The Money? Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet @Liam Halligan or @GBNews. But stay with us, because this is GB News. I'm Liam Halligan, and for the next 2 hours, you're on The Money. Now, the price of buying a home grew on average by an astonishing 14.3% during the year to March. That's according to the Nationwide, and it's the fastest growth rate in 18 years. Nice if you're an owner-occupier. or if you're lucky enough to have a portfolio of buy-to-let properties. Pretty miserable if you're a young adult living in your childhood bedroom, or a young couple sick of sharing and keen to start a family. The price of the average UK house rose to £265,312 last month. That's £33,000 higher than in March 2021. House prices accelerated in most UK regions. But with city living less desirable since the pandemic, price rises in London actually lagged much of the rest of the country. Today's reality is that around a third of first-time buyers and over half in London and the South East are helped with deposits to buy their own home from their property-owning parents. Those without that option are often condemned to years of renting, paying off someone else's mortgage, despite working just as hard. And that's what causes resentment. On top of all that, renting's getting more expensive. New data shows the average cost of renting across the UK rose to £1,115 per month in March. That's 9.1% up on March last year. At the same time as the cost of living squeeze gets tighter, mortgage lenders are restricting those affordability tests, making it tougher to borrow enough to buy your own home. Lockdown has highlighted the gulf between the comfortably housed in homes and flats of their own and those in cramped rented accommodation. And the reality is the average home now costs almost 9 times average annual earnings, compared to a historic multiple of just 4 times. Is it any wonder so many young adults, even as a couple, even with professional jobs that they've worked really hard to get, cannot afford their own home? And that's your On the Money question today, a question I've posed before, but one with which, without apology, I'm posing again. As property prices spiral, how can my kid afford a house? Grown-up conversations with people who know their stuff. That's what we do on the Money, and I'm joined by Rose Grayston, friend of the show. She's Senior Programme Manager for Housing at the New Economics Foundation and also an independent housing consultant, formerly of the housing charity Shelter. Freddie Poser is from Priced Out, a campaign group driven by young people who are sick of renting and want to buy their own homes. James Greaves is the director at Jamin Estate Agents, knows the market backwards. And Justin Urquhart-Stewart, he is the co-founder of Regionally, back in the studio once again. Rose, let's turn to you first. I mentioned before your work with Shelter over the years, a very distinguished housing charity. How do you feel as a young person, as an academic, a housing campaigner, when you see that house prices are up 14% during the year to March?
It's incredibly frustrating, but we should not have expected anything else to happen. The really important thing we have to understand is that we have made choices as a country, our government has made choices, which meant that this was bound to happen. Above all, we cut stamp duty in the pandemic for everybody, including investors, including those buying second homes and holiday homes, including buy-to-let investors. This was a crazy thing to do. And it's particularly felt by people in the northwest, in Wales, people in scenic rural places, where house prices haven't just gone up by 14% over the last year, they've gone up by 22% or even more. This is absurd, and it was bound to happen. I speak to MPs all the time now, including Conservative MPs, Labour MPs, the Dem MPs, that say that their crucial services, teachers, hospitals, fire services, police, cannot recruit. They cannot keep their communities going because people on a normal wage cannot afford to live in those places. It's not just home ownership, although that is extremely concerning. It's also long-term lets. We're now seeing
with rent costs going up.
Rent costs going up, but also in some communities, the disappearance of the private rented sector as an option for people, not just because they're priced out, but because it no longer exists. It's been replaced by Airbnb. It's been replaced by short-term holiday lets. We have to ask ourselves who and what the housing market is supposed to be for. I'm a big fan of holidays. I'm also a big fan of people being able to go on holiday in their own country and not necessarily taking lots of flights every year. But it's simply not sustainable to have a situation where you have communities where people living in that place on local wages cannot even afford to live in the private rented sector, let alone get some proper security through home ownership.
Freddie Poser, let's hear from you. How do you feel when you read or you hear me saying what you already knew, that house prices are up 14% during the year to March, according to the Nationwide?
It's depressing, and as you say, we already knew, and we knew it was going to happen. It was inevitable. I disagree that it's actually to do with mortgages or stamp duty. All of these are shuffling deck chairs on Titanic, frankly. We haven't built enough homes. We have more people wanting to live here. If we want to reverse this in the short or long term, we need to reduce planning burdens. We need to build more homes, both for social, affordable and market rent. And we need to build them across the country. It really is that simple. We can ban holiday lets, or we can clamp down on buy-to-let. Hopefully that would make a small difference. But frankly, if there isn't enough space for people to live in, people aren't going to be able to buy the home they want. People aren't going to be able to start the family they want. And we're going to hamstring ourselves and the economy.
James Greaves, let's turn to you. You are a property industry professional at Jamin Estate Agents. We're seeing in the data that buy-to-let landlords are returning. Quite a few of them sold during the pandemic, but now they're coming back. There are more buy-to-let landlords buying than selling these days. Tell us about that trend, and tell us about the regional trend that I highlighted at the outset and which Rose also highlighted. The fact that house prices, it's no longer just a London and the South East phenomenon. We've got spiralling prices across the country.
Yeah, I mean, our company is based in Staffordshire and the West Midlands, and we've seen quite a substantial increase in both the value of the houses and also the rent values have gone up quite a staggering amount over the last 12 months. Just to pick up on what you said before, buy-to-let investors have come back after probably 2 or 3 years of quieter times. They've come back this year and last year in abundance. I think a lot of the reason for it is because those that do have a large amount of cash are experiencing such low interest rates in the bank that by investing in property, they can generate a higher return of 5 or 6%, which is obviously detrimental to first-time buyers because then they are competing with the investors who are picking them up, and without having to have mortgages, they have a lot of leverage and sway over the people that are selling them. So you have the lower-end affordable properties being snapped up very, very quickly by investors, with often 2 or 3 people outbidding each other to buy them.
Justin, you're all for high investment returns. You're all for financial ingenuity. You've spent a lifetime in financial services, but we're not building enough homes, are we?
Yeah, it's a fundamental issue. There isn't enough. Good old-fashioned supply and demand. But also we've got some structural issues here. The biggest problem we've had is we don't do the long-term planning. Structurally, where do we need to have the population to be producing stuff, whether it's manufacturing or services, and how do you make sure you've got the transport and facilities and the infrastructure there? We are far too short-term. Also, we then have an attitude that somehow you must own a house, whatever happens. Whereas you go back a generation, you didn't necessarily have to own a house. You owned a long-term lease, maybe a lifetime lease, and you still paid rent, but at a lower level. So we did end up with a fixation, and I could get concerned sometimes that people are almost being forced to buy because you always make money out of property. Actually, no, you don't. You go back and you'll find times where people actually lost out very heavily indeed. So let's not always get fixated on it. It's good that people want to own, but don't think it's a guaranteed one-way street.
All the surveys show, though, Rose, don't they, not least of your generation, Freddie's generation, that people who are asked if they had a choice, they would prefer to buy. The security that it gives you, the long-term returns it gives you, even though there are short-term ups and downs. And it strikes me, I often hear campaign groups say, oh, but there's no room and we're concreting over the countryside. What's that number? What's the share of the UK or the English landmass covered by residential properties 5%. And gardens? It's tiny, isn't it? Whereas the Greenbelt is 13% and it's growing all the time. Why is it so difficult for you, even someone like you, persuasive people like Shelter, so many think tanks are campaigning for more homes. Why is it so difficult to get politicians to facilitate the building of more homes?
If we actually did build so many homes that prices came down, it would negatively affect everybody that is already invested in home ownership. This is the bind that we're in. people in different tenures have really different interests in this area. As you know, I don't actually believe it's possible in the system that we've got to persuade private house builders to build so many market homes that prices will fall, because to do so would mean that they wouldn't make a profit, because they pay for land up front on the assumption that they're going to be able to sell the homes that they build on that land at current prices or
But you want them to build more homes to stop them spiralling, so prices level out compared to earnings, rather than facilitating some kind of crash by overbuilding.
That is exactly what we need. It's not going to happen unless we reform the land market. I would say the more immediate solution is that we build council housing. We build council housing to meet need. If we've got millions of people that can't afford rents, that can't afford to house themselves decently on the market, as we do, why don't we build homes to meet the needs of those people? Rather than building homes at market prices and hoping that prices fall enough that those homes somehow end up in the laps of the people that really need them, those that have the lowest incomes that, you know, we know are frozen out of the housing market, whether for renting or for buying, why don't we just build homes to meet need? We have done it before. We didn't have a housing crisis in this country in the 1970s because successive governments of both stripes built hundreds of thousands of council homes every year, as well as market housing. You need both. But for years now, we haven't had the council housing. I think 2008 was the last year where we built more council housing than we sold off and demolished through right to buy and the like. That is not a sustainable position for this country.
Rose Grayson, stay with us. Freddie Poser, James Greaves of Jamin Estate Agents there in Staffordshire, Justin Urquhart Stewart. We are going to continue this important discussion. How can my kid afford a house? This is On the Money with me, Liam Halligan, on GBNews TV, DAB+, digital radio and online. Stay with us.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
And welcome back. You're On the Money. This is a 2-hour special. Today, in this hour, we're asking, how can my kid afford a home? This after news that the price of an average UK house is now £265,312. Rose to that in March. £33,000 higher than March 2021, an astonishing 13% increase. House prices are up in most UK regions, and I'm still with my expert panel. Freddie Poser, let's go back to you. You are from Priced Out, a campaign group mainly of younger people sick and tired of renting. What would you say to those, Freddie? Well, Justin suggested it here. He totally gets where you're coming from, but do you really need to own? And what about the massive increase in the UK population that we've seen?
I think it'd be a real shame to make people give up on the dream of owning a home. Clearly, it's not the be-all and end-all, and for some people, it might not be right to own a home. They want the flexibility. But I think it's a shame to convince ourselves that not everyone wants to own a home. If someone wants to own a home, they should be able to. It should be achievable to everyone, and then we can discuss whether or not everyone needs to do it. It's also a question about owning versus renting is a bit of a, it's a bit of a red herring, because as house prices get higher and higher, rents get higher and higher as well. The thing pushing house prices higher, the reason that you can get 5 or 6% yield on a buy-to-let property is because rents keep rising. It's that simple. We have more demand for homes than we have supply. Rose is absolutely right. We need more homes everywhere, and council homes would be a great start, because if you can have a high-quality, affordable council home, not only does that give you a place to live, that puts downward pressure on the private rented sector as well to bring down those rents, which also affects the yield you can get as a buy-to-let landlord, bringing down the prices eventually. Every level of the market needs new supply. I also think that the rising British population is a good thing. We should be proud that people want to live in Britain. And frankly, it's our housing crisis that's stopping people living here. It's stopping people starting a family. It's depressing fertility rates. It's a real shame that because we haven't built enough houses, the economy and the population isn't allowed to thrive.
James Greaves, you are director at Jamin Estate Agents there in Staffordshire. You're a property professional doing your thing, earning an honest living. Where does this end?
I think what he just touched on, the growing demand for property, it doesn't seem that is going to be suppressed. It's going to keep going on. The other thing we notice is people are looking to move out and live on their own at an earlier age. So previously it was after university or even into 30s. Now we come across people 17, 18 wanting to move out of the parents' house and start renting. Now, if more and more people are looking to do that and live independently rather in groups of 2s or 3s, then we need more property to satisfy it. In the absence of that, as the situation we have, if one property comes on for rent, or wanting that property, and they will often outbid each other to try and secure it. That is exactly the same with the sales market. The moment a new property is launched, there's that many people looking to buy at the moment that it pushes the prices up with what's known as gazumping, where people offer a price, the property's sold, and then days later somebody offers an even higher price. And all those factors contribute to a growing value in terms of the selling and also for the rent values. I can't see how it's going to decrease unless there is a significant increase in the volume of houses available, or there are price caps put onto the rental market, which again, I can't see happening in the near future.
The thought police are at your door. James, you're speaking the truth. Yeah, I think that was your doorbell going there, or maybe it was Freddie Poser's doorbell. But James, with all respect, you are in Staffordshire, a beautiful part of the country, a part of the country I know well, a part of the country with some great local businesses. But it's not like the beating heart of the UK economy, is it? With all due respect, it's largely an agricultural part of the country. And even you in Staffordshire, a house comes on, you got half a dozen people that will pay the asking price, you have a bidding war.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is because obviously people used to live in Birmingham city centre and London. Because of how things have changed with people working from home, the desire to be in the city centres to be that close to where they're working has eroded very rapidly. So people choosing to relocate to suburb areas for a little bit of more beauty of where they're living as opposed to living in the city centres, so they can take advantage of local amenities without having to commute in. So that's pushing up the demand for the semi-rural, and that is going on all around the country, not just in Staffordshire. So all the smaller areas which people didn't used to have a demand for rental properties or even to live, people are looking at those areas more than they were before because they can work from home, or if they do have to go into the office, it's not every day, they can commute in for that one day. So again, it's a little bit of a change as well in how we live and how society has changed. And that's been coming on over the last 10 years, but obviously heightened and sped up significantly by the pandemic.
Good points, James. Well made. Justin Urquhart-Stewart, you all know as an investor and economic analyst, demography is destiny. You know, the reason the UK is going to become a bigger economy than Germany in the next 20, 30 years is because we have a younger demography. We have higher birth rates. But Freddie Poser really puts his finger on something that I know Rose Grayston's written about as well. This housing shortage is now messing with our fertility. You've got people in their 20s and 30s who are not having kids because they're in rented accommodation sharing with their university mates into their mid and late 30s.
So we're actually ruining the basis of the development of our economy. We've been really good at developing our economy by having new businesses setting up, focusing on technology, being able to actually make it easier for people to run business. But if they cannot actually live in the right place to be able to operate these, then we are actually just fooling ourselves. This is a lack of political strategy. Now, I appreciate lots of things change. So therefore, what was suitable 40 years ago is obviously different now. But fundamental things such as using the fibre capability to make sure you got more efficiencies of scale around the country. This is opening up. But of course, then the impact that has on local housing, local facilities, you can't get the people, can't get the teachers. Again, this is strategic planning. And unfortunately, our politicians think in terms of 5 years, not 50.
Rose, back to you. We have to be careful here, don't we? We need a private rented sector. It's increased from about 10 to 20% of households in recent years. A lot of the buy-to-let sector is just ordinary people with one buy-to-let property instead of a pension. They're good landlords. They're kind to their tenants. They've given their tenants, rent holidays during the pandemic and so on. So it's not as if the private rental sector is bad, is it? But you just think, along with Freddie, that more people should be able to own their home and take part in the kind of rising wealth of the population as we grow.
In a situation where for decades now we haven't built enough homes of any kind, least of all social homes, the private rented sector is crucial. We need a private rented sector. We need a large private rented sector that is capable of housing people that can't house them, that can't afford to buy, and for whom there isn't social housing anymore. One of the most worrying trends we're seeing at the moment is the shrinking of the lower end of the private rented sector. And I'm really sympathetic towards good landlords because they have been affected by the poor design of universal credit, where, for example, if you lose your job or lose some of your income and you go onto universal credit, you have to wait for 5 weeks before you get your first payment. Now, for a landlord, that makes that household really risky.
Yeah.
And that is one reason why we're seeing more and more buy-to-let landlords exit that kind of market.
Yeah, that kind of social renting, where part of the rent is paid with housing benefit.
It is becoming harder to be a decent landlord that makes that contribution to the housing market in that way. And that should be a worry for all of us, because while I support mass council house building, while I support increased housing supply in general, in the short term, we are not going to be able to house our people without the private rented sector.
Very, very interesting. Rose Grayston there, formerly of Shelter, now an independent housing consultant and campaigner. Thanks to you, as ever. Indeed, Freddie Poser of Priced Out for your excellent contribution, and James Greaves of Jamin Estate Agents in Staffordshire. Very interesting points, and Justin is going to stay with us. This is On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. Coming up, it's today's Money Talks interview on a similar theme, because it's with Claire Miller of the Clarion Housing Group. That's an organisation on a mission to provide affordable homes for those in need.
Affordable, good quality, sustainable homes. We're the biggest social housing organisation in the UK. Equally, we're here about creating sustainable, future-proofing homes for people to purchase.
That interview coming up with the Clarion Housing Association. More on that after the GB News headlines with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon, it is 1:31. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date. The UK has warned all options will be on the table when it comes to the West's response if Russia uses chemical weapons in Ukraine. The government says it's working urgently to verify claims that chemical weapons were used in an attack on the besieged city of Mariupol. That's after the Foreign Secretary described any such action as a callous escalation in the conflict. The Conservative MP Crispin Blunt has apologised for defending the convicted sex offender Imran Ahmed Khan. He was the Wakefield MP who appeared in court yesterday, found guilty of sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy in 2008. Well, he's now been expelled from the Conservatives. Well, Crispin Blunt said Khan was the victim of a dreadful miscarriage of justice, but he retracted that statement this morning. At least 30 new fines are going to be issued over COVID breaches at Downing Street in Whitehall. That brings the total now to more than 50. The Met Police is investigating a dozen gatherings allegedly held during lockdown. Scotland Yard says more fines could come. More than 60 Extinction Rebellion activists have blocked the entrance to the Lloyd's of London. The demonstrators are demanding the company stop insuring fossil fuel projects. They're using superglue, chains and bike locks and say their aim is to close the business for a day by preventing staff from entering the building. You're up to date now on GB News. We're on your TV, online and your radio. Don't go anywhere. Liam's special On the Money will be back in a moment.
Hi there, I'm Aidan McGiven. It's been a wet start to Tuesday for many of us. That rain now moving north, warming up in the south behind the rain with some sunshine, but also a scattering of heavy showers. Low pressure keeping things unsettled at the moment. That low pressure sitting to the southwest of the UK. It is, however, drawing up some warmth from the south, along with these bands of rain. One band of rain clearing from the Northern Isles, although sticking around for much of the day for Shetland, and the next turning up into central, eastern and southern Scotland, parts of Northern Ireland and northern England, and also a few more outbreaks of rain stretching back into central England. Otherwise, skies brightening and temperatures rising. Could see 20 or 21 Celsius, somewhere like East Anglia this afternoon. However, for eastern and southern Scotland, northern England, feeling cold with that rain and a strong wind from the North Sea. Heavy showers breaking out as the day comes to an end across much of England and Wales, and then further showers continuing into western parts through the night, whilst the persistent rain carries on in the far northeast of Scotland, along with the brisk wind. But for most, it's a frost-free night, a good deal of cloud cover, low cloud at that, so a gloomy start to Wednesday. A lot of mist and sea fog around some of these western, southern and northeastern shores. The rain in the far northeast of Scotland tends to ease through the day. It continues, I think, for Orkney and Shetland for much of Wednesday. Otherwise, brighter skies follow, but further heavy showers, perhaps even a few thunderstorms across parts of southern England and East Wales. But it will feel warm where we get some sunshine, 20 or 21 Celsius. And for Scotland, less cold compared to today, but still temperatures are not far from average for the time of year in Scotland, whilst it's sunnier and warmer elsewhere. And then into the outlook, well, the weather turns warmer still heading into the Easter weekend. For many places, it turns brighter, but there will still be a few showers around.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. You're on the money with me, Liam Halligan. Now, the war in Ukraine rumbles on, and we've obviously seen related fuel price rises and increasing costs for food as well. Ukraine is, of course, one of the biggest exporters of many crucial products like sunflower oil, potatoes and wheat, as is Russia. That's why so many of the UK's 10,500 chip shops are feeling the financial heat. The National Federation of Fish Fryers warns up to 3,000 local chippies could close as the cost of the food that they need to make their products rises. And food prices are, of course, set to rise further as this war in Ukraine continues, along with related Western sanctions and Moscow's countermeasures. Joining me now is the owner of Chunks Fish and Chip Shop in Hartlepool, Michael Ward Lewis, and President of the National Federation of Fish Fryers, Andrew Crook. Great to have you both with us. Can we see you, Michael, in the Chunks Fish and Chip Shop in Hartlepool? Thank you so much for joining us. Tell us about these rising costs of your inputs, of fish, of cooking oil. Does that mean you're having to increase the costs, the prices that you charge the punters when they come in for their fish and chips?
That's right, yeah. We've had to raise our prices a few times in the last 6 months. Fish prices as well, we've seen at Fest that started to raise drastically and went up by 35%. Obviously, we have to pass the rises on to the customers, and it's been met okay so far, but we have had some resistance, and we do know from a lot of the social media groups on Facebook that people aren't going to be willing to pay higher prices if we go much further.
Sayward is there with you. Are people asking you why their price is going up, or do they kind of get it? Are you getting a hard time? Because people who want their fish and chips, but they don't want to pay more money, do they?
No, they don't. And it's one thing, I tried to warn everybody about 2 weeks before this last price rise that are regular customers and explained to them any minute I had to kind of lessen the backlash. But it's still too much for them, and we've gone from cheapest chips to really expensive.
Very
it's a luxury
interesting
item as I look at it.
Well, stay with us. We'll come back to you, but I do want to bring in the president of the National Federation of Fish Fryers, Andrew Crook. Andrew, this isn't a joke, is it? I mean, for a lot of communities, their local fish and chip shop is a place to eat nutritious food that's relatively affordable, is quick, it's nutritious. If chip shops are going out of business, that's not going to do anyone any good.
No, certainly not. I mean, we're a big part of the local community as well, and we employ local people, we spend our money locally. Some of the young people that work in our industry take those skills with them for the rest of their life. So we're part of the fabric of society, and we certainly don't want to lose it from the high streets. But this really is a serious threat, and a lot's beyond anyone's control. It's market forces and post-pandemic inflation. Then we've got the effects of the conflict just starting to hit us with the oil prices, and fish will come into that as well. But unfortunately, the government didn't take any steps to keep VAT low on hospitality, which is something that everybody's calling out for in hospitality. And I think they use fish and chips. The Prime Minister used fish and chips in one of his Build Back Better videos on social media, but they've not done anything to change it. So they're building back worse, and we really think it's time to revisit that.
It's worth saying for quite a lot of the pandemic, hospitality outlets, food outlets, it was 5% VAT, then 12.5% VAT, kind of emergency rates. But now you're back on the full fat 20% VAT, just at the time when your input costs, the cooking oil, the fish, the spuds, are going up so much. What would you say to punters who are concerned that chippies are charging too much these days?
Just stick with us. We really don't want to put prices up. Nobody wants to put the prices up. We cringe every time. And if you see prices go up, you can believe that the shop really should have put it up by more. We're definitely absorbing these increases. It's not about profiteering. It's really about survival. And it's not something we relish doing, but we've got to do it to survive. And we just hope people continue to use us, because if you don't use us, you lose us. And as I said, we're such an important part of British life. We're second only to the Queen when people are asked what they think of Great Britain. And it'd be such a shame to lose this industry and lose the independence that plays such a big part in it.
Let's go from Lancashire there back to the northeast in Hartlepool to Chunk's Fish and Chip Shop. Michael and Saywood Lewis, you've built this business. It's a much-loved fish and chip shop. I've got a lot of mates in the northeast. I've phoned up, I've checked you out. The fish and chips are fantastic. Is your business under threat?
Sadly, very much so. We've been crunching the numbers, and with that...
Yeah, with the extra VAT that's been put back on now, things aren't looking good for us. So it's at the minute we're still just riding it out. If things change, then it will be great, but we can't see that in the near future, and it'd be a struggle for us, especially if prices are going to continue to rise and we're going to have to re-look at our prices and less custom. It's just eventually just becomes not manageable.
Obviously, a fish and chip shop uses lots of cooking oil. You're deep fry specialist is what you do. How much has the cooking oil that you use so much of gone up in recent weeks, given that Ukraine and Russia produce so much of it?
80% increase.
And that's a big chunk of your ingredient cost, right? It's a lot more expensive than the spuds that you use.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It's very expensive. And then with our fish prices being driven up as well from Americans, ironically, buying a lot of the Icelandic cod from the sanctions on Russia. It's just staggering. One of our local chippies that we're really good friends with just closed a few weeks ago, and they've been open for 25 years.
Wow. That's really, really something. Let's go back to you, Andrew Crook. What is your message to Boris Johnson? You're there in Lancashire. You are the president of the National Federation of Fish Fryers. This is not a flippant story. This is our national dish. Chip shops are often the beating heart of communities. Quite often, if I say with all respect, of lower income and more vulnerable communities, seaside towns. What's your message to the Prime Minister?
Well, we work with many government departments working with DEFRA at the moment with the current crisis and BAYS and through the pandemic. But the one department that seems to ignore us is the Treasury, and we just want to sit down with the Treasury and let's have a look at VAT, because the system, we have VAT on takeaway food for 38 years, nearly 50 years on everything else. And it's just time to have a look at it, because the world's changed and we just need that support. The 17 European countries have got a lower rate of VAT for hospitality, and the rest of hospitality in this country is now asking for the same thing. So we think it's really important that we take a second look at this. I know we missed a spring statement, but with a chance to come back and just, please, it's time to have a look at the VAT system. That's a lifeline for this industry, and we really do need the support.
Well, Andrew Crook of the National Federation of Fish Fryers, and indeed Saywood and Michael Lewis up there in Chunk's Fish and Chip Shop in Hartlepool. Thank you so much for that discussion. Michael and Saywood, stay in touch with us here on The Money. We want to know what happened to your business. We want to give you a platform so you can tell government ministers what you need to keep your business going. That's what we do here on The Money. Thank you both so much. Let's bring in some of your views now on housing. Lana says, I'm a retired accountant and I think a major house price correction is inevitable. Interesting. I'm hearing that more and more. David says, my wife and I earn almost £100,000 between us yearly. Lucky you. But even on this combined salary and £25,000 in savings, we can't afford to buy a house in or near London. I have to commute 50 miles each way every day. Something has to change. Elaine says we need to build more housing, but if we build on agricultural land, we will have a conflict between food security and fulfilling housing need. I don't agree with that, given that so little of the UK's landmass is actually built on. It's well under 5%. But anyway, Peter says, I grew up in Scotland in the 60s and 70s, living in a town that was 99% council rented. Rents were affordable. Selling off council houses at massive discounts was a huge mistake and depleted stock. Mike says, very interesting subject. Thank you, Mike. We do try. I live in Kingston upon Thames. down there in southwest London, and we are building flat after flat. They're making some bad areas look worse. What about the infrastructure? It's a common refrain. Torquay says, why do housing discussions never mention the impacts of immigration? Well, they do, and I did, and my book on housing, Home Truths, also has a whole chapter on immigration. But anyway, there are now extra 4 million people living in the southeast of England than there were in 2001. That's why we need to build more houses. Ted says, when I bought my first house, it was difficult. My wife had to take a full-time job. My mortgage was only 3 times my salary, and that's the point. I gave up holidays and the rest. Are the property owner wannabes prepared to give anything up? I think they are, Mike, and I think that's unfair. Because when you I think that's unfair, because when you bought that first house, the average house price was 3 or 4 times the average salary. It's now 9 times, and that's a national average figure, a massively historic high, and that's the problem. And on fish and chips, Bernard says they never drop the price rises on potatoes, so profit on chips is far more than they should be. I think that's a bit rough, Bernard. The fish and chip shops are having a hard time. Keep your emails coming. Tell me what you want to be discussed here on the show. And it's time now for my daily interview series, Money Talks. I'm talking to Claire Miller. She's Chief Executive at Clarion Housing Group, one of the UK's housing associations. It's one of our largest social housing organisations, looking after those homes for low-income and vulnerable households. Claire's a chartered accountant by training. She has almost 30 years' experience in housing sector. And having joined the Housing Corporation in 1992, she rose to become Director of Regulation, and now she's the Chief Executive of Clarion. As I say, one of Britain's leading housing associations. It oversees more than 100,000 homes across England, housing almost 400,000 people. Clarion also develops new homes with a mission to provide houses and flats for those who need the most. And here she is in the studio to discuss this really important topic. Claire Miller, she is my latest guest on Money Talks.
Good afternoon.
Claire, great to have you in the studio. I'm a bit of a housing nerd, as you may know. We discuss this topic a lot here on The Money. How can my kid buy a house? You may have seen our discussion earlier. We had Rose Grayston, Freddie Poser, people with real knowledge in this area. Why aren't we building more council houses, more social housing?
It's a great shame that we're not, because there are so many people in unsatisfactory accommodation who would really benefit from an affordable home. The reason we're not building enough is a capacity issue, and it's because of lack of investment over many years. And the government, to be fair, have recently increased the grant rates that allow us to build the most affordable accommodation, but it is still a drop in the ocean when you look at council house waiting lists.
1.2 million the last time I looked.
Indeed,
huge number.
And we are, as a country, targeting building 300,000 new homes a year. But we haven't got anywhere close to that in the last few years. My own organisation last year built 2,300 new homes, and that's one of the largest outputs of a social housing provider. But we would love to build more.
Now, housing associations are a very kind of British invention. They've sort of evolved. You sit between the state and the private sector, if I may say so. You manage social housing on behalf of the state, but you also develop houses for private rent and indeed for purchase. What's the biggest barrier, Claire Miller, to us building more social homes? Is it a lack of land at affordable prices for local councils and indeed housing associations to build homes that are affordable for the state to rent out at subsidised rents or for people to buy at an affordable level?
So the price of land undoubtedly affects what we can do. Clarion is a national housing association, so we develop across the country in towns and cities. We go up as far as Manchester and Leeds and Bradford, where I think you visited some of our homes. We're down in Plymouth, and we're at all points in between. The price of land in the UK is a huge disincentive to be building affordable homes. And indeed, the economic return that we make on building affordable rented homes is only earned over 30 or 60 years. So when you build an affordable home today, we are making a loss on every new home that we build. Of course, what we have done is to build communities with mixed tenures. So we build for sale, for rent, and for part sale and part rent. And the economics of that model enable us to do more than we would otherwise be able to do. But there is no doubt that the price of land is a huge inhibitor.
It's a big discussion. We could get into the intricacies of the 1961 Land Compensation Act, etc., maybe on another occasion. I know you've thought and written about that, as has Rose Grayston. I've done the same. But let's just stick with the basics for now. A lot of people talk about the right to buy. We saw the right to buy explode during the 1980s under Mrs. Thatcher, Michael Heseltine, Peter Walker, the Trade and Industry Secretary at the time. That legislation was meant to be implemented in a way that for every house a council sold off, they had to build another one. But the sales happened, but the building didn't happen. Why was that?
And that is a major reason why we're in the position that we are in now. It is true to say that it is almost impossible, with the discounts that apply to right to buy, for the receipt that anybody earns from selling a home to build another like it in the same place.
And local authorities, if they build a home and then sell the home, 4/5 of those receipts then go back to the Treasury.
That's true.
So what incentive have local councils got to build? It's almost, to me, as if the system is rigged to build as few social houses as possible at a time when a lack of social housing means, you know, despite the efforts of the likes of Clarion, I've got a lot of admiration for the housing associations. You'll know that from what I've written. But despite your efforts, there are kids living in damp, inhumane conditions, unsanitary conditions in this country, as well as kids growing up in bed and breakfast, temporary accommodation, which has to be terrible for them. It tears at the social fabric. And yet, rather than building more council houses, we are now spending tens of billions of pounds a year on housing benefit. That seems mad.
It is, and one of the particular tragedies is that the housing stock in the UK is ageing. And there is no government support currently for regeneration. And yet there is a huge need for estates and places to be regenerated. And it is only the likes of housing associations that do that work, because it is not economic for a private house builder to engage in that activity.
And while there are some decent social houses that are in high rises, in the end, what people want, they want low rise, low density, affordable social housing. So in the end, we are going to have to build more homes. But Claire Miller, I'm sorry, we've got some breaking news. We do have to leave it there. You are from Clarion Housing Association. I look forward to having another conversation with you. For now, thanks for being my latest guest on Money Talks. Claire Miller there from Clarion Housing Association. Join me now for some breaking news is the GBNews political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, take it away.
Yeah, good afternoon, Liam. Well, in the last couple of minutes, Downing Street, in fact, have confirmed themselves that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, are going to receive fixed penalty notices or fines relating to Partygate. Of course, the police have been carrying out, haven't they, an investigation for months now into alleged rule-breaking inside Number 10 and Whitehall. We can now remove that word alleged. We know that there has been rules broken. Up to 50 people inside Number 10 and Whitehall have been handed these fines, which means that they broke covert rules. Covert rules, of course, that applied to all of us, but ultimately were set by the people inside Number 10 and Whitehall, but broken by the people inside Number 10 and Whitehall. Downing Street this afternoon saying that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer have today received notification that the Metropolitan Police intend to issue them with fixed penalty notices. We've no further details, but we will update you again while we do. Quite an extraordinary development, Liam. We know that much of the heat and momentum has been taken out of this story, hasn't it, in recent weeks, not least of all because of the dreadful war in Ukraine. But this still is, as I say, quite an extraordinary moment, quite a sensational moment, that the Prime Minister, the man who set the rules, is now being fined by the police for breaking them. I don't think we really have an historical precedence for all of this. It will pile pressure again, of course, on the Prime Minister, and it must be said, the Chancellor too, about what they knew, what they didn't know, what they did and what they didn't do. And I think it raises that fundamental question that Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, asked of Boris Johnson at the height of all of this, which was, did the Prime Minister break the rules unintentionally, i.e. he didn't even know what the rules were that he had set, or did he do so deliberately and mislead Parliament? And that is going to be the big fundamental question the Prime Minister is going to face in the hours and days to come. There is a sense, as I say, that this is not necessarily going to bring down his government now, given where we're at, though you could never rule that out. But there is still a lot of anger out there and a lot of questions that the Prime Minister and indeed Rishi Sunak will have to answer.
Darren, I'm reeling. This is really big news. I mean, how does this work? This means, doesn't it? And we've got to absorb the judgment and really look at the details. But at first impression, this looks as though the Prime Minister consistently misled the House of Commons. I mean, there are implications when any cabinet minister misleads the House of Commons, right?
Well, under the ministerial code, if it's done intentionally, it is in precedent and in theory, and more than that, in reality, it should be a resigning issue. The question is, did the Prime Minister do it intentionally? Now, Downing Street have always seemed to suggest that the Prime Minister took on face value what people were telling him, and that the rules were followed at all times, the guidance was followed at all times, that no rules were broken. The problem is now, for that argument from the Prime Minister, is it doesn't matter whether other people told him the guidance and the rules were followed. It's pretty clear he didn't follow them because he's now facing a fine by the police for not following them. So in the end, again, it comes back to this question. Either he broke the rules knowing he was breaking the rules, or he did so not knowing he was breaking the rules. And that raises the question, how the damn did the Prime Minister not know that he was breaking the COVID rules that he set and was pleading, asking, demanding the rest of the population to stick by? So this is very, very tricky. It will certainly mean that many MPs who, for the time being, had been on the fence saying we wanted to see what the police were going to say. I think this is going to, again, raise that question in their mind about where they stand in all of this, whether letters of confidence could yet again be resubmitted to Sir Graham Brady in the 1922 committee. Could we get to a stage again where there could be a leadership challenge for the Prime Minister? As I say, the sense in Westminster is that this story has somewhat been on the back burner, but this, as I say, sensational announcement from the Met that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have been fined raises all those questions again, Liam.
Well, Darren, we will return to this, of course, in the next hour as we go into the second hour of this 2-hour On the Money special. But for now, it's the top of the hour and it's the GB News headlines once more with Rosie Wright.
Well, good afternoon. It's just gone 2 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright in the GB News newsroom. Now, as we've just been hearing, some breaking news for you in the last half an hour. Number 10 has confirmed the Prime Minister and the Chancellor will be fined over lockdown breaches at Downing Street and Whitehall. It's after police said at least 30 new fines were going to be issued over COVID breaches at Downing Street. It brings the total number now in Downing Street and Whitehall to more than 50. The Met Police is investigating a dozen gatherings that were allegedly held during those coronavirus restrictions. Scotland Yard says more fines could come. When we get on more information, we'll update you here. Now, the UK has warned that all options will be on the table when it comes to the West's response if Russia uses chemical weapons in Ukraine. The government says it's working urgently to verify claims that chemical weapons were used on an attack in the besieged city of Mariupol. The Foreign Secretary described any such action as a callous escalation in the conflict. The Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, told GB News he's worried about a renewed assault in the east.
I'm concerned in that I think that the fighting that is going to happen this spring and this summer in the Donbass is going to be extremely violent and will be quite a big army on quite a big army. They clearly have the May the 9th victory parade in mind, as a date by which they need to have achieved something.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says thousands of civilians have been deported from occupied regions and placed into what he described as filtration camps.
Documents are taken away from them, they are interrogated, humiliated. It is unclear how many people were killed. Many of those who were deported were sent across Russian regions. They are forbidden to leave. It is obvious that it is an attempt to get rid of witnesses of Russian war crimes committed in Ukraine.
Well, Russia's president says attempts to isolate his country from the rest of the world will fail. Speaking in Russia's Far East, where he met his Belarusian counterpart, Vladimir Putin also said Moscow will never depend on the US and its allies again after they imposed crippling sanctions. He also repeated his country's ambitions, saying the military operation in Ukraine will achieve its goals. In some other news now, the Conservative MP Crispin Blunt has apologised for defending the convicted sex offender Imran Ahmed Khan. The previous Wakefield MP, who appeared in court yesterday, was found guilty of sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy in 2008. He's now been expelled from the Conservatives. Well, Crispin Blunt had said that Khan was the victim of a dreadful miscarriage of justice, but Blunt retracted that statement this morning. More than 60 Extinction Rebellion activists have been blocking the Lloyd's of London building today. The demonstrators are demanding the company stops insuring fossil fuel projects. Lloyd's of London has advised its staff not to go to the impacted office. Our reporter Alice Porter has been there.
Extinction Rebellion have been here for over 4 hours, causing so much trouble in the centre of the city. They've blockaded entrances and exits into Lloyd's. Many of them have glued their hands to the floor or have chained themselves to the railings to stop anyone coming in and out. The reason they're targeting Lloyd's is they say they insure fossil fuel technology, and they've been protesting last Friday of people coming into the city in regards to that. But they're also trying to recruit more people. Protesters say to me they're trying to recruit 3.5% of the population to join Extinction Rebellion and continue causing chaos in London and other cities as well.
The number of people on payrolls rose by 35,000 between February and March, but the latest figures from the Office for National Statistics also shows workers suffered the biggest fall in real pay for almost 9 years. Experts are warning wages are set to lag even further, with inflation expected to soar by autumn. The Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says his plans for a windfall tax would help ease the cost of living crisis.
The thing that's coming up over and over again is people saying, I can't afford to pay my bills. What are you going to do about it? So the Labour Party says we're going to have a windfall tax on oil and gas companies in the North Sea, profits they didn't expect to make because of the high global prices, use that to reduce energy bills by up to £600 for those that need it most.
You're up to date on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's return back to Liam and On the Money.
Well, this is On the Money, but we're going to be off the money for a while because we're dealing with this breaking news that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak have been issued with fines by the Metropolitan Police for breaches of COVID-19 regulations during lockdown. I think we can talk to Darren McCaffrey first. Darren, you and I are just digesting this story. You're digesting your lunch. How serious is this? It strikes me that this is unprecedented.
Unprecedented. We think that potentially Boris Johnson is the first Prime Minister to knowingly, that we know of, to have broken the law while Prime Minister. And at a time, of course, Liam, when these laws were being imposed in an unprecedented way across the whole country, that everyone was not just expected to abide by, but the government were at times threatening people, you remember, during the first lockdown and subsequent ones, that if they didn't, even harsher laws might be brought into place to deal with it. But in the last 10 minutes or so, Downing Street have confirmed that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have today received notification that the Met Police intend to issue them with fixed penalty notices. We heard, didn't we, a little bit earlier on this morning, that 50 fixed penalty notices were going to be handed out. That is 30 in addition to the 20 we knew in the first batch. And yes, this is very, very tricky. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's not just the Prime Minister, it's also Rishi Sunak, who's, must be said, frankly, having a terrible couple of weeks in politics. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has come out in the last couple of minutes saying that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak have broken the law and repeatedly lied to the British public. They must resign. The Conservatives are totally unfit to govern. Britain deserves better.
I mean, if we're not clearly we think, to the extent anything's clear in the middle of this sort of news tsunami, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, they're not going to contest this. They're not going to appeal. They're going to say a fair cop. They're going to pay the 50 quid, take the much bigger symbolic damage, political collateral. But if we're not going to suddenly have a general election in the middle of a cost of living crisis and a war in Ukraine, which I think would really fray national nerves, where is the wiggle room here? Where is the political room for manoeuvre? Is it, as you said earlier when we were speaking, just before the news headlines, in this notion of was it intentional or unintentional? Because the ministerial code, as you rightly pointed out, Darren, says it's a resignation issue if you intentionally do wrong.
The thing is, even whatever the answer to that question is, and I think, I talked about how Theresa May picked up on this at the height of it, it's not great for the Prime Minister either way.
Sure.
I mean, obviously it's worse than if he intentionally broke the rules and then intentionally essentially lied to Parliament.
But he'll say Downing Street, it's a workplace, the blurring between work
Indeed,
and, you know, they were all there 24 hours saving the nation or whatever it was.
Indeed, and that is an argument, of course, Downing Street will make, that Downing Street is a unique place. It's his home, but it's also his office. But in the end, he should have known where the line was. I mean, he's the Prime Minister. He set these rules. The police have found out that he didn't know where the line was, that he did break these rules. Now, we don't know what party this is in relation to. Many people suggesting it maybe being that birthday party that was a surprise party inside the Cabinet Office. We think the Chancellor was there at the time. Obviously, that was reported by the Times newspaper at the time and wasn't part of the controversy. But there were allegations of other parties taking place in Downing Street that the Prime Minister...
Civil servants
may
too,
have been
right?
part.
Without ministers present.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, this is not just in relation, these fines, to the politicians, but to civil servants too. I think this gets really tricky for the Prime Minister, just finally on this, Liam. If, for example, Rishi Sunak was to view this himself as a resigning matter, and if he
which he may want to do anyway. There's been talk about, I'm going to go to Southern California and be a tech mogul.
Yeah, if he was to walk away and resign on this issue, that would double the pressure.
As a final parting shot to Boris.
Well, I mean, and it would make it very, very difficult indeed. But Conservative MPs are now getting to the point again. We've still got Sue Gray's report to come out, don't forget as well. Getting to the point again where they're going to have to start considering about how much damage this is going to do, whether it's sustainable to have Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. And all this, don't forget, we have got elections up and down this country.
The local elections.
In just a couple of weeks' time.
Indeed. Tom Harwood, now our political correspondent, joins us from what I imagine, Tom, is a pretty febrile Westminster.
It certainly is. Now, the big point here is that Parliament is currently in recess. Most MPs are away in their constituencies, which means that, of course, we are not going to hear parliamentary scrutiny of the Prime Minister over this announcement that Number 10 has now confirmed of fines to both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. We're not going to hear parliamentary scrutiny of that for almost a week until Parliament returns in the middle of next week. Equally, it means that there's not going to be that much journalistic scrutiny of the Prime Minister for a week, unless, of course, the Prime Minister holds an extraordinary press conference. That seems, however, unlikely at this stage. The Prime Minister's spokesperson up until now has said that the Prime Minister would go to Parliament upon the conclusion of Sue Gray's investigation, not the Metropolitan Police's investigation. Now, of course, the Metropolitan Police issued those further 30 requests for fines to be issued today. We don't know how many more will be issued. We don't know if the police have now considered their investigation closed, if 50 is the total number of fines that has been issued across Whitehall, across Downing Street, across the arms of government. We simply don't know the answer to these questions at this stage. But if this is the conclusion of the Metropolitan Police's investigation, that means that soon Sue Gray will be able to release the entirety of her reports, that report that was so hobbled those months ago. And when that entire report is released, the Prime Minister has pledged to come to the House.
Tom, we are in the realms of speculation here. I don't know what's going to happen. Darren doesn't know what happened. You don't know what's going to happen. And we follow this stuff for a living. I mean, could we be, you know, in general election territory soon?
I think it's incredibly unlikely we'll be in general election territory. What most people are speculating about is whether or not we will be in leadership election territory, changing the Prime Minister without changing the Parliament. Now, I think that it's probably too soon to speculate on that issue. Why? Because in just a couple of weeks' time, the country goes to vote. Those local elections on the 5th of May may well be the make or the break for this administration and this Prime Minister. One of the points that is probably saving Boris Johnson right now is there is zero consensus within the Conservative Party as to who might replace him. Of course, the extraordinary news that the Chancellor Rishi Sunak is implicated in these fines as well is going to be a significant stumbling block for those that assume that a leadership election could be swift or indeed predictable. It will likely be neither of those things at this point. And just one further point on the fact that the Chancellor has been issued a fixed penalty notice as well. It leads the suggestion to be that the particular event that breached those guidelines was a birthday party on the 19th of June in Downing Street, in the Cabinet Room. That birthday party that was reported in the Telegraph not so long ago. But interestingly, 2 years ago, this particular event was reported in The Times. The Times on the 20th of June 2020 added colour to a piece about the trials that the Prime Minister was going through. They said that the Prime Minister had brief respite from hard work in the Cabinet Room, tucking into cake with the Chancellor to celebrate his birthday. Well, the fact that that was published 2 years ago in The Times, the fact that that was published and no one really cared that it was published, that it was added in as flippant detail, as colour to a piece about something else, suggests that there may be a get-out clause for the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. Why? Because the Chancellor and the Prime Minister may not have breached the ministerial code in terms of lying to Parliament if they believed what they did at the time was within the rules. If Number 10 briefed the Times newspaper that this event happened, clearly they thought that that event would have been within the rules, even if the Metropolitan Police now are saying that it breached the rules. Potentially a slim avenue there by which the Prime Minister and the Chancellor could argue that they did not breach that aspect of the ministerial code, that they do not need to resign as a result of that. It's an interesting thing to note that this particular event, this birthday party with that cake in the Cabinet Room, was reported at the time and no one really batted an eyelid. And yet when it was re-reported in the context of the general atmosphere of Partygate, suddenly the investigation began and it became a rather more serious matter. An incredibly interesting event and an incredibly interesting course of events to have followed.
There from Tom Harwood, Darren, a range of possibilities, a Tory leadership election. You know, I suggested a general election. Why? Because there could be a vote of no confidence. Who knows? Yeah. Yet Tom also makes a very compelling, he's not making a case, he's analysing, but he reminds us that at the time the rules were different. But a year on, where lockdown had dragged on, political attitudes hardened, the public's impatience with lockdown hardened. So maybe there's a lot of looking back in anger here. At least that's what the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are going to argue.
Yeah, and they will. And Tom's right in pointing out there that clearly one of the lines of defence that the Prime Minister has always held is that Downing Street is a unique place, and as is the supporters, and this may have been a surprise birthday party. First of all, I mean, we should make it clear, we don't know that this is definitely in relation to that event, though right. Tom is entirely right in suggesting it was widely reported at the time, was reported in the Times newspaper, and no one kind of batted an eyelid. All I would add, though, is I think we wouldn't be here if that was it. Yeah. Now, we're looking at 50 people, or 50 instances of fixed penalty notices, and potentially up to 18 separate parties that took place inside Downing Street. And it wasn't just the birthday party we know the Prime Minister was at. He's admitted had been at other events as well. So I think while the Prime Minister might well try and use that argument, and Tom is entirely right, that if it is in relevance to that, people could put up a pretty strong case against it. But when you remove it and put it in its wider context, we've got essentially over a dozen parties, dozens of people fined.
Senior civil servants.
Senior civil servants. And a Prime Minister who repeatedly in Parliament, let's not forget this, said at all times the guidance was adhered to, no rules were broken. We now know that that factually was not the case. And again, even in the kindest way, if you're being generous to the Prime Minister, the question still boils down to the fact, how did you not know that you were breaking your own laws?
That is the question. Darren, hold that thought. We'll be joined by a Conservative backbencher very soon, but let's turn firstly to John McTernan, political strategist who's advised the Labour Party. Indeed, he was Director of Political Operations for Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister. John, good to see you here on GB News. How bad is the damage? Obviously, Keir Starmer's saying Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak should resign. If you were a betting man, what would you bet on the most likely outcome?
I would bet that they stay, but they stay damaged. And I think that this cements the view the public have, that the Prime Minister they elected was a man who they thought they could have a joke with, they could have a drink with. They thought he was the life and soul of the party. Turns out he does like a party, but he also likes a joke. And he likes, he thinks the joke is on the public. The public feel they've been made fools of. What was it? There was a poll that said that only 32% of the country thought he was not a hypocrite. That's the core Tory vote. I think swing voters have been massively lost by this. Couldn't happen at a worse time. The run up to the local elections, a chance for people to just express anger about everything. There's anger about cost of living, anger about the Spring Statement, anger about Rishi Sunak and his family, his household's tax affairs. Now anger about Partygate stirred up again. It's a perfect storm, and you can imagine what the first PMQs after recess is going to be about.
Liam, can I interrupt you for one second?
Darren McCaffrey's coming back.
So we're also Sorry, John, to interrupt as well. So we're also just learning, we know the Chancellor, Prime Minister facing a fine, and this is where I come back to, that this is simply not about that birthday party. In the last minute or so, the Prime Minister's wife's, Carrie Johnson's spokesperson, has confirmed that she too will be facing a fine. In a statement, says, in the interests of transparency, Mrs Johnson can confirm she's been notified that she will receive a fixed penalty notice. She's not received any further details about the nature. And we have to remember there were allegations, not confirmed, but there were allegations at the time that some of these parties, or at least one of these parties, may well have taken place inside the Downing Street flat. This is another very significant moment that the Prime Minister's wife is also going to face a fine. Though she was at that birthday party, Cabinet's surprise party as well, so it may be in relation to
the one reported in the Times in June 2020. John, going back to you, your Conservative equivalents advising the Prime Minister, they will surely be urging him to focus on the fact that Downing Street may be presented as a grey area. It's a home, and it's also not just a place of work, a place of national governance and leadership, stressing that senior civil servants are also likely to be fined. The details are just coming out. To what extent do you think swing voters will buy any of those arguments, given the focus on the cost of living, given that the Tories will be saying this is all trivial, it's all history, people care about schools, hospitals, feeding their family?
Look, I think the thing is, any one of these things would be really challenging for a career in politics at the top. It's a cluster of them together. That's the power of this. And I think the difficulty about the Conservative Party arguing, time to move on, let's focus on bread and butter issues, is if you want to look at the bread and butter issues, they're terrible. They're the cost of living. Are people's schools better? No, they're not. There's been a huge row about the catch-up investment for kids who've fallen behind over the last couple of years. Are schools better in terms of breakfast clubs over school holidays? No. Are hospitals better? Waiting lists are soaring, and because of the impact of living with COVID, there's no real cuts coming for the foreseeable future. I think Sajid Javid has said waiting lists for health are going to rise till 2024, but so are taxes, and you're going to end up with Labour saying crime up, taxes up, waiting lists up. Everything is rising, everything's going up, and that's the problem for the government, that everybody's got a grievance now, and it's not simply the people who didn't vote. It's not simply the Remainers. It's not the usual suspects. This is Middle England is now going to look at this and go, this isn't what we voted for. And I would be advising the Prime Minister not to say that was a long time ago, not to say other people did it. Cop it, take it on the chin, make a speech, say you've let down the country that you so want to serve, that you will, because of this, you'll work harder to achieve the things. And I'd actually, if I was advising, I'd say now is the time to have an emergency budget. So cop this now personally, cop it in the May elections, and pivot out in June, have an emergency budget, and throw as much of the taxpayers' money at the taxpayers as you can to try and buy back some of the votes.
John, final question. John, sorry, John, to interrupt. We've got other guests to come in, but I do want to ask you this final question. Given your knowledge of the Labour Party, you are steeped in the traditions. You know all the back alleys. This is your world. If we are entering a big political moment here, is Keir Starmer ready to strike? Isn't he more of a Kinnock than a Blair?
So the thing about Keir, you've got to remember, back when the story first appeared in the Mirror, I, like many other people in Westminster, thought this is not going to break through. Keir's a prosecutor. He saw this story. He could see the thread. He's pulled at this. He pushed at this when it didn't feel like it was going to break out into the public. He caught the point that this was the way to really, really damage the Prime Minister. He's now damaging the Chancellor. He's damaging the government. The longer, when the Tory party decide to keep the Prime Minister in place, they decide to damage their brand to keep the PM in place. So I think the thing is, Keir made the decisive strategic choice to go on this issue, and Labour is now reaping the benefits.
John McTernan, former political advisor to Tony Blair. Thank you so much for your contribution. Always good to see you here on GB News, John. Let's talk to the Conservative MP and Boris Johnson ally, another GB News regular. It's Michael Fabricant. Michael, it's not looking good.
No, it's not looking good. And I do agree with John, actually, in his assessment of where we go from here. Look, a fixed penalty notice, of course, is like a speeding fine. I'm not trying to underestimate the importance of this. Boris or anybody with a fixed penalty notice can appeal. You can actually say, I don't accept this and I now want to go to court, because I think one of your earlier commentators said that he has to accept it. Legally, he doesn't, but I'm quite sure he will and will pay the fixed penalty fine. However, I think what he needs to do, precisely as in fact John was saying just now, is go to the House of Commons, make a statement, say that he accepts that he was wrong in that he thought he was not breaking a rule because the House of Commons premises, the number 10 Downing Street place is a workplace. And also he lives there, therefore he wasn't inviting outside guests, etc. He didn't think he was breaking the rules, but clearly he did. Now, they weren't wild parties, but nevertheless, they were sufficiently deemed to be some sort of party that he has now received this fixed penalty notice. But I think Boris, at the end of the day, has the support of most people who realises that in this difficult time, he's doing a good job at being Prime Minister.
Well, hold it there for one moment. Stay with us. Darren McCaffrey.
No, I just want to ask, actually, Michael, a question, which is that in the grand scheme of things, and that's a very valid point that you made, but we know, don't we, Michael, that in law, ignorance isn't a thing. You can't claim, I didn't know what the law was.
No excuse.
And so the Prime Minister can't really, this is the weird thing, is the Prime Minister not only should know what the law is, he came up with it. So how is his defence that, it's a home, it was difficult to judge what it was because Downing Street's a unique place. Like, frankly, ignorance is not a defence in the line of the law. Where is his defence and all of that?
Darren, let me get in there. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. I'm going to show off ignorantia juris non excusat. So he can't use that as a defence if he was going to try and legally defend himself. But what he can say to the House of Commons, and I hope he does say, is, look, I'm incredibly apologetic for what has happened. I did not lie to the House of Commons because I genuinely believed
that I had not broken any rules. And the reason why I'm saying this, by the way, is that Keir Starmer's line of attack is that he lied to the House of Commons. I don't think he lied to the House of Commons for one moment. I think he genuinely believed he was sticking to the rules. So he's not going to use it as a legal defence, but he can use it, I think, as a moral defence.
Let me put this to you. If we're not, he may try and style it out. I think I agree with you that I can't see him, rejecting this, appealing this fine. I think he will take it on the chin. I'm just thinking about the parliamentary arithmetic. You are a Boris Johnson loyalist, and that's fine, but not all your backbench colleagues are. The Labour Party need only, and the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, has called for Boris Johnson to resign. With an 80-odd seat majority, you only need 40 of your backbench colleagues to switch, to say enough is enough. And if public discontent and impatience with the Prime Minister is big enough, they need to do that to hold on to their seats. They will switch. Could that be possible? Could we be in no confidence territory?
We could be. First of all, there's two aspects to it, actually. One is the no confidence territory. The other one are the letters that go into the chairman of the 1922 to Graham Brady. And don't forget, of course, our majority was reduced by a further 1 today, so it's not 80. I'm not quite sure what the number exactly is, because of Imran Khan, who lost the government whip when he was convicted yesterday, for his sexual activities. So the point of the story is that I believe that there could be a vote of no confidence, which could be put by Keir Starmer, although, of course, not long ago, Keir Starmer was saying that Boris shouldn't resign, whatever happens, because we're in the middle of a wartime situation. They could be triggered by the members of Parliament themselves. Now, House of Commons Conservative MPs may decide to do something. There are those who've never liked Boris, who didn't like Brexit, and this is on the Conservative side, and may decide now is the moment to put letters into the chairman of the 1922. There's a whole series of possibilities that may happen, which I think will not be in the best interests of this country, and certainly won't be in the best interests, as it happens, of Ukraine.
We've got local elections coming on the 6th of May. The Tories are going to get hammered, aren't they?
Well, this is not going to help, that's for sure. So going back to your previous contributor, John, I really do think that, we've got Prime Minister's question time to come. We've got all these events, as I say, various people who may have a vote of no confidence, either in Boris, because this would be Conservatives, and there may not be enough to trigger that, by the way, or indeed Keir Starmer pushing it, though Keir Starmer will have an egg on his face if he goes for a no confidence vote and then finds that the Conservative Party rallies behind, because turkeys don't vote for Christmas. Because remember, if you have a vote of no confidence in the government, it calls for a general election. And just as you're saying correctly that this is not going to help local elections, and the local elections were always going to be difficult for us, by the way, because 4 years ago we had done exceptionally well, then, it might well be that all the Conservatives would rally behind, and Keir Starmer will end up with egg on his face, as previous leaders of the opposition have done when they trigger a vote of no confidence and nothing comes of it. But yes, you're right. This is not going to help. And I really do think that Boris has got to do a mea culpa. Yes, I'm guilty. I am sorry. I misinterpreted the rules. And saying, that we were working hard during the day and these were just breaks which were held afterwards. I mean, I know, for example, nurses who, after a long, hard day working on shift, would go back to the staff room and open a bottle. Now, that technically is not a party, but and neither would you argue, perhaps, that what Boris was doing was a party. But nevertheless, he's the one who's received the fixed penalty notice, and he, as you quite so rightly have said, is the one who wrote the law in the first place.
Well, Michael Fabricant, MP for Lichfield, Conservative, Boris Johnson ally, we thank you for that contribution and your analysis. Stay with us here on GB News. We're going to be staying with this astonishing story. Both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor among those fined off by Scotland Yard for pandemic-era parties in Downing Street and across Whitehall. The GB News headlines now at 2:31 with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon, it's 2:31. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date. Now, breaking news this hour, as we've been hearing, Number 10 has confirmed the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Chancellor Rishi Sunak will both be fined over lockdown breaches at Downing Street and Whitehall. The Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer is calling for their resignation, saying they've broken the law and repeatedly lied to the British public. The Prime Minister's wife, Carrie Johnson, is also set to receive a fine. Earlier, the Met Police said at least 30 new fixed penalties are being issued, bringing the total number now to more than 50. The UK has warned all options will be on the table when it comes to the West's response if Russia uses chemical weapons in Ukraine. The government says it's working urgently to verify claims that chemical weapons were used in an attack on the besieged city of Mariupol. It's after the Foreign Secretary described any such action as callous escalation in the conflict. More than 60 Extinction Rebellion activists staged a protest blocking the entrance to Lloyd's of London. The demonstrators are demanding the company stops insuring fossil fuel projects. Now, they've been using superglue, chains and bike locks. They say their aim is to close the business for a day by preventing staff from entering the building. You're up to date. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Shortly, we'll be back to On the Money.
Hi there, I'm Aidan McGiven. It's been a wet start to Tuesday for many of us. That rain now moving north, warming up in the south behind the rain with some sunshine, but also a scattering of heavy showers. Low pressure keeping things unsettled at the moment. That low pressure sitting to the southwest of the UK. It is, however, drawing up some warmth from the south, along with these bands of rain. One band of rain clearing from the Northern Isles, although sticking around for much of the day for Shetland, and the next turning up into central, eastern and southern Scotland, parts of Northern Ireland and northern England, and also a few more outbreaks of rain stretching back into central England. Otherwise, skies brightening and temperatures rising. Could see 20 or 21 Celsius, somewhere like East Anglia this afternoon. However, for eastern and southern Scotland, northern England, feeling cold with that rain and a strong wind from the North Sea. Heavy showers breaking out as the day comes to an end across much of England and Wales, and then further showers continuing into western parts through the night, whilst the persistent rain carries on in the far northeast of Scotland, along with the brisk wind. But for most, it's a frost-free night, a good deal of cloud cover, low cloud at that, so a gloomy start to Wednesday. A lot of mist and sea fog around some of these western, southern and northeastern shores. The rain in the far northeast of Scotland tends to ease through the day. It continues, I think, for Orkney and Shetland for much of Wednesday. Otherwise, brighter skies follow, but further heavy showers, perhaps even a few thunderstorms across parts of southern England and East Wales. But it will feel warm where we get some sunshine, 20 or 21 Celsius. And for Scotland, less cold compared to today, but still temperatures are not far from average for the time of year in Scotland, whilst it's sunnier and warmer elsewhere. And then into the outlook, well, the weather turns warmer still heading into the Easter weekend. For many places, it turns brighter, but there will still be a few showers around.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. You're with GB News. We're examining the political fallout from the news that Scotland Yard is fining both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor for pandemic-era parties. Darren McCaffrey, how are the other party leaders reacting?
Yeah, unsurprisingly, a lot of reaction coming in this afternoon. Labour, Sir Keir Starmer, who's up in Scotland today, saying that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak have broken the law and repeatedly lied to the British public. They must both resign. The Conservatives are totally unfit to govern. Britain deserves better. That's according to the Labour Party. Let me take you to Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister. She says that Boris Johnson must resign. He broke the law and repeatedly lied to Parliament about it. The basic values of integrity and decency, essential to the proper working of any parliamentary democracy, demand that he go, and he should take this out-of-touch Chancellor with him, because we know that obviously the Chancellor has been fined as well. And the Lib Dems also essentially calling for immediate recall of Parliament, because as you well know, Liam, Parliament is obviously on its Easter recess, so the MPs can hold a vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson as Prime Minister following these revelations. That's from Ed Davey, the leader there. Just to add to this, though, obviously the opposition are piling in, as are some Conservative MPs. But let's, again, step back a little bit. If this had happened at the end of January, the Prime Minister would be in an incredibly difficult position. There is a sense that this story has moved on, that the momentum, even with this rather sensational news today, has been sucked out of it. And I still think we are not on the verge yet of a leadership challenge. And by the way, even in a logistical sense, we probably wouldn't know about that in terms of the letters of no confidence in the Prime Minister until next week, because in theory, Sir Graham Brady, who collects these, would only let us know when Parliament is sitting.
Saved by the recess for now. We heard just recently from the Tory MP for Lichfield, Michael Fabricant. More senior Conservatives will start to speak out, but let's for now go to Michael Jacobs. Michael, always good to have you here on GB News. You're a former advisor to Prime Minister Gordon Brown. You're also Professor of Political Economy at the University of Sheffield. What do you make of this? What would you be advising Keir Starmer now?
Well, I don't think I need to advise Keir Starmer. I'm not an official Labour Party spokesperson at the moment. Keir Starmer has called on the Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak to resign. I think that is the least that we could expect. It's not just the fact that he's been, both of these men have been fined by the police, so they have broken the laws that they were making, but that the Prime Minister lied to Parliament, and lying to Parliament is a resigning offence. That is the convention we have in this country, and it seems to me that this is as clear a case of lying to Parliament as can be imagined. I think your correspondent is probably right that this won't have the traction within the Conservative Party that it would have had it come out a couple of months ago. But frankly, what's going on inside the Conservative Party is irrelevant. The Prime Minister has broken the law, not a Conservative Party rule. And he's broken the convention, which is that you don't lie to Parliament, which is also nothing to do with the Conservative Party. So frankly, Whether or not Conservative MPs think this is serious enough to call for a leadership election within the Conservative Party is really irrelevant. Luckily, it isn't up to them, and it is now going to be up to the voters because, for entirely fortuitous reasons, this is now falling within a local election campaign, and it seems to me inevitable that the voters will cast their verdict on the Prime Minister's and the Chancellor's behaviour.
You know the political game, Michael. The wiggle room is in the word intentional. Did the Prime Minister intentionally lie? His supporters will be saying, we knew about this party a long time ago. It was reported in the papers back in the summer of 2020. At the time, it wasn't seen to be a significant rule break. It was only later, when political attitudes hardened and the public's impatience with lockdown hardened. Lots of senior civil servants, I imagine, will also be included among those fined. Couldn't some of those factors act as a kind of intellectual shield for the Prime Minister?
No, because this is about the law. And the reason why the Metropolitan Police issuing fines is so significant is that it's nothing to do with the interpretation that people might have said. You know, the Prime Minister invented this extraordinary, mythical thing called a work event. Some of us were saying, well, what exactly is a work event? It's either a work or it's a social event. And the Metropolitan Police has cut through all that verbiage and said, no, the law was broken. And remember that the law was applied by the police to ordinary people at this time. You had police fined for holding parties, sometimes very large fines. It'd be interesting to see exactly how much the Prime Minister and the others have been fined this time. People were prevented from attending, as we know, deeply emotional family events, funerals and so on. And that was because there was a law. And Prime Ministers should not be breaking the law. And when a Prime Minister is found to have broken a law that he himself has made, then I think they should pay the consequences. It's absolutely nothing to do with the interpretation of these events. That's why this is such a significant moment.
Michael, I know you tried to keep yourself away from the political fray. You're now a policy analyst, a professor. You're a distinguished regular contributor to my own show, On the Money, about economics and business and policy and so on. But I have to ask you this, the same question I asked another distinguished former Labour advisor. If we are entering a big political moment here, and even though it's recess and even though the story may have moved on, we may yet be, is Keir Starmer more of a Kinnock than a Blair? Is he ready to seriously challenge the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson?
I think he is. And a lot of this is, of course, to do with the Prime Minister. I think if the Prime Minister were a more serious character who was responding to the deep troubles that we now have in this country, it's not just the war in Ukraine. The cost of living crisis is a reflection of an economy that doesn't work under serious conditions. If we had a Prime Minister who was a really serious person, then I think the Labour opposition leader would be challenged more. What we have is a Prime Minister who is unfit for office, and I'm afraid that is now the conclusion of the police in what they have said that he did. And obviously they're not saying he's unfit for office, but they have said that he has broken the law, he has lied to Parliament, and therefore I think the position that Keir Starmer finds himself in, rather fortunately, is that the public will think we really shouldn't have this person in government, and then they will look to the opposition leader, and Keir Starmer, I think, looks like a competent, sound, ethical politician of the kind that you probably need after the kind of character that we've had in Boris Johnson. So I think the bar is relatively low for Keir Starmer, and I think he easily hurdles it. I think he is very much more like a Blair than a Kinnock in that sense.
Interesting thoughts as ever, Michael. Always good to have you on the show. Michael Jacobs there, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Sheffield, a former advisor to Prime Minister Gordon Brown, as was Darren. You've been hoovering up information there, getting reaction. You've been following social media, reading the news wires. What are your thoughts?
Well, so where we stand now this afternoon is that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor and the Prime Minister's wife have been fined a part of up to 50 fines that have been issued by the police into parties that took place in Downing Street and Whitehall. The number of parties we don't know. The Prime Minister himself, by the way, doesn't know why he's received this fixed penalty notice for what alleged, for what wrongdoing. I keep saying the word alleged. We've now gone beyond that. I mean, we know that the law was broken. Now, fixed penalty fines, you can appeal them. Doesn't mean in itself it is an actual conviction. I cannot see why the Prime Minister would go down that route. But this is very, very tricky indeed, because for lots of the Prime Minister's critics, and for lots of the Prime Minister's friends, it must be said too, that he stood up in the Commons, not once, not twice, but time and time again at the back end of last year, and he said at all points the guidance was followed and that the rules were followed. And I think then this gets to the crucial matter. He also said, when it turned out, of course, after the Allegra Stratton video, that it was obvious that something had gone on.
The former Downing Street advisor.
Yeah, he said that he was told that the rules had been followed, that someone had been telling him. And yet it turns out that he has broken the rules. So he didn't need someone to tell him. It turns out the police have found he's broken the rules. I should say, because I know you're going to talk to Mark White now, and what's also fascinating in all of this is, at the time, the police were not going to investigate this. Do you remember Dominic Raab, who was Justice Secretary at the time, said the police don't retrospectively look into COVID-breaking fines? Now we're in a situation where the two most powerful politicians in this country have been issued fines by the police for breaking the rules that they set.
Astonishing. Let's go to GB News Home and Security correspondent Mark White. Mark, what's your reading on the legalities of this? Pretty unprecedented territory, as Darren's just been saying.
Well, unprecedented in terms of a sitting Prime Minister being fined in this way. Of course, not unprecedented if you are one of the thousands of people across the country who were subject of these COVID fines during the height of the pandemic. What Darren was saying just before you came to me about police not retrospectively investigating these fines, that by and large was true. And it was one of these issues that actually chipped away at the leadership of the Met Commissioner, now the former Met Commissioner Cressida Dick. Remember, she did not want her force being involved in what would be a political storm. And of course, eventually she and her force were bounced into having to investigate that because the public outcry was so very significant at that time. So ever since then, they have been involved in this very detailed examination of multiple parties, attended by multiple people, including some very senior figures indeed. And it has come as a shock, I think, for everybody today to hear that Rishi Sunak is one of those who has been issued with a fixed penalty fine. I think people thought that there was a significant chance that Carrie Johnson would be receiving a fine, but not necessarily Rishi Sunak, as for all we can see, the involvement of him was briefly in that birthday party when Boris Johnson received a cake, popping in to congratulate him. Certainly when he was questioned on this recently, he seemed quite blasé about it, didn't think there was any risk of him being issued with a fixed penalty notice at all. Well, he has now, along with the Prime Minister, and I guess all eyes are on him. He's pretty beleaguered at the moment because of what's been happening with his wife. Does he decide to just leave office? And that would put, of course, Boris Johnson in a very precarious position.
Mark, I guess what the Prime Minister's allies will say to their red in the face that it was unintentional. The Ministerial Code says you resign if you intentionally misled the House of Commons. They're pointing to the fact that Downing Street is a place of residence, it's his home as well as a place of work, as indeed it is for the Chancellor. And if senior civil servants broke these rules as well, clearly this wasn't necessarily a moral failing, however galling it seems to so many members of the public who did adhere to all the rules during lockdown, despite all the pain that caused them.
Yeah, those are well-worn arguments, but they are going to be aired again in the coming days and weeks. I'm not sure whether the Prime Minister or indeed his officials have the stomach to take this to appeal in the Magistrates' Court, because what's that going to do? It's only going to drag it out, and it's going to examine those events in minute detail, which will just give further ammunition to those opposed to him to heap further embarrassment on the Prime Minister. So I'm not sure that is an avenue that realistically is open to them. So really the only avenue that is open to them is to try to argue, to reason with people, to suggest that yes, clearly by the letter of the law they broke the law under the COVID lockdowns that were imposed by this very Prime Minister. However, because of all the circumstances you just reiterated there, you just mentioned in terms of this being his own home, work events that were taking place late into the night because of the hours they were working, perhaps this is their avenue to try to reason their way out of it. But there's no doubt it will be very difficult for the Prime Minister in the days ahead. And as I say, it all depends on, I think, what happens to his neighbour in Downing Street now and how he decides to play this, because I think it's difficult to understate how much of a shock I think this will come to Rishi Sunak, because he clearly didn't think that he was at risk of actually being fined at the end of the day. He felt that his involvement in any of the activities around Partygate and the events that were taking place was very minimal and very, very short-lived. But clearly, weighing up all the evidence that the Metropolitan Police have done, they've spoken to multiple people, they've come to the conclusion that 50 people so far are in breach of the law, have broken the law as far as those COVID guidelines are concerned, and there may be others yet to come.
Mark White there, GB News Home and Security Editor. Thank you so much for that analysis. Well, we are facing local elections on Thursday, the 6th of May. They are always going to be important. They've now taken on a huge significance. So who better to talk to than Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, Britain's best known and best psephologist. Sir John, what do you make of it? How damaging is this going to be in those local elections?
Well, it is Boris Johnson's good fortune that the local election landscape that he's having to defend is not a particularly good one. The last elections were held in England back in 2018. And at that time, the Conservatives and Labour were roughly neck and neck with each other. Now, the Conservatives are behind in the polls, and they've been behind in the polls ever since Partygate broke. But about 5 points or so, which would point to losses, but not necessarily to dramatic headline losses, simply because also, A, a lot of the councils that are up being contested are councils already in Labour hands, and B, in most of the councils outside of London, only 1/3 of the seats up for grabs, which limits the amount of damage that can occur. That said, sure, Tory MPs will be looking at the runes between now and then, assuming a move is not made against Boris Johnson before then. Otherwise, I mean, it has to be said that amongst the public, as we are told is also the case amongst Tory MPs, some, though not all of the steam of the Partygate affair, had gone out of the public win. So we go back to January, when people were being asked then whether Boris Johnson should resign. We were getting between 3/5 and 2/3 of people saying he should, and that was including about 40% of people who voted Conservative in 2019. A couple of polls fairly recently have asked explicitly, look, if Boris Johnson is fined, should he resign? Figure's still high enough. It's been just over 50% in both cases, around 30% of 2019 Conservative voters, but it's 30% more than 40%. But of course, once something happens, how the public will react is often very, very difficult to tell. And certainly I think what must be in the back of the mind of 10 Downing Street is the realisation of the amount of anger that the public did express when this story first broke. And maybe that anger will now be rekindled in full, even if the embers had died away somewhat during the course of recent weeks.
That is the crucial question, isn't it? We can look at polls, but when the shock of the headlines, obviously the nation's front pages are going to be absolutely splattered with this story, not just tomorrow, but for days to come. But we are, John, in the middle of a cost of living crisis. We do have huge events happening, benefits going up by far less than the rate of inflation, the biggest cut in real wages post-inflation that we learnt about this morning since 2013. War in Ukraine, Britain very much involved in the geopolitics of that. Is there any chance, as the Prime Minister surely is hoping, that this is going to be seen as another Westminster story, an inside SW1 story, a kind of character assassination of the Prime Minister? Or are we beyond that, given how shocking these headlines will be for days to come?
Well, I think the other consideration is simply going to be is how do Tory MPs feel about the ethics of the situation? I mean, I suspect there are some Conservative MPs, and certainly many of a Conservative member, who just simply goes, this is not the kind of thing that a Prime Minister should do, and will feel uncomfortable about Boris Johnson remaining as leader. Others, in contrast, however, irrespective of the public reaction, may now be asking themselves, well, but hang on, if Boris Johnson does go down, who is to replace him? I think we now know one answer to that question, and that is not going to be Rishi Sunak, who was the favourite just a few weeks ago. I think what's happened today certainly puts paid to that. But there isn't, therefore, as a result, any obvious clear front runner. And certainly the challenge now both to Boris Johnson and certainly to any potential challenger is indeed to demonstrate that they do have answers to the questions of the cost of living crisis, to the problems of Ukraine, etc. And I think certainly one of the criticisms that's being made of Rishi Sunak, and therefore perhaps also by implication by Boris Johnson's government, is they didn't necessarily have the kind of grip over the cost of living crisis that the public were looking for. So if Boris Johnson is going to look for credit elsewhere, he's going to have to find a way of proving to his party that he actually is able to deal politically and intellectually with the problems that his administration faces.
John Curtis there, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. So, John, we are grateful to you for appearing on GB News. We look forward to returning to you for your words of analysis in the coming hours and days. Let's now bring in Ed Davey, of course, MP for Kingston and Surbiton, Lib Dem leader since 2020. Ed, good to have you on the show. What are your thoughts?
Our great country cannot have criminals and liars leading our government, especially at a time of national and international crisis. Let's remember, millions of people made huge sacrifices during the pandemic, and it's clear now that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak just took them for granted, and while they were breaking the law, partying in Downing Street, they're just not fit to hold office. And if they had a shred of decency, they would resign.
What the Prime Minister's allies would say, Sir Ed, is that he didn't break the law intentionally. Other senior civil servants broke the law. We knew about this party back in the summer of 2020. It was reported and barely caused a murmur. Also, I'm sure Conservatives will be saying, is this really a time for political turmoil, a time when there's a cost of living crisis, a time when the country is at economic war?
Well, first of all, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have been failing millions of families and pensioners over the cost of living crisis. If they'd handle it a bit better, maybe more people have sympathy. But I think people watching your programme will saying, well, not only have they failed to help us with these rising heating bills, rising petrol bills, rising food bills, they've actually made it worse with a series of tax rises that are really unfair and no help for pensioners. So the government has failed in its top duty to help and protect people from the cost of living crisis. And then internationally, frankly, there's cross-party support for the help we're giving to Ukraine. Liberal Democrats have argued the government should do more to help Ukraine. So, frankly, the Prime Minister and Chancellor must go. And if they don't go, I hope the Speaker will recall Parliament immediately so MPs of all parties can hold a vote of no confidence in this government. And that will force Conservative MPs to come off the fence. You know, they should be doing their patriotic duty. It's the Conservative MP's patriotic duty to kick these criminals out of government once and for all. And the failure of Conservative MPs to do their patriotic duty, frankly, it makes them guilty by association.
I put it to you, you're a very experienced parliamentarian. Is this the time for a vote of no confidence, which is what you're now pushing for? Is this a time for a general election, which is what that could ultimately spark? Is the country capable of withstanding that with everything else that's going on?
I think there'd be millions of people who would welcome that, so we could have a fresh start. And let's remind you, in the middle of the Second World War, when we were in perilous danger, Parliament voted to get rid of Neville Chamberlain and bring in Winston Churchill. So in moments that are far more perilous than now, we changed the leadership rightly then. I think a change of leadership now and consigning this failed Prime Minister and Chancellor to the dustbin of history would be a good move for our country. And what Liberal Democrats are calling for is for either them to go or the Conservative MPs to do their patriotic duty for once, or for Parliament to be recalled. We have to have a change at the top. The Met Police, in serving these notices and finding the Prime Minister and Chancellor guilty, I think they've shown the way. They have to go.
Davey, Lib Dem MP, we thank you for appearing on GB News. Stay with us here on GB News. All the sharpest political analysis in the wake of this shocking news that both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have been fined by Scotland Yard over those lockdown-era parties. Lots more to come in the next hour after the GB News headlines with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon, it's just 2 minutes past 3. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date. As you've been hearing, Number 10 has confirmed the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Chancellor Rishi Sunak will be fined over lockdown breaches at Downing Street and Whitehall. The Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer is calling for their resignation, saying they've broken the law and repeatedly lied to the British public. The Prime Minister's wife, Kerry Johnson, is also